Most people don't know about it, but it's a key component of American history right there underneath their feet.
Well, Purysburg was an interesting town, started in 1732. It was a thriving river port, eventually failed. The Americans used Purysburg as their base of operations. There's a lot to be said for being able to stand on a spot and say, this is the spot. These are the places where freedom happened. So if you treasure the concept of freedom, then it's important to commemorate these places.
On a series of frosty mornings in the winter of 2015, a team of archaeologists cleared a path through the dry leaves and bare branches of the South Carolina lowcountry, searching for long-lost evidence of an obscure but important battle of the American Revolution.
I got a musket ball here, Dan. It's a nice one.
Nice. Drop?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, good
gunflint.
Yep.
All right.
Now that's
cool.
military.
Yeah, look at that. Nice.
It was a lopsided contest between more than 1,000 angry redcoats and a relative handful of surprised patriots. Yet it was a battle in which the victors never fired a single shot. The story of Purysburg takes many twists and turns. It begins in 1732, 1 year before the establishment of Savannah, just a few miles away. A Swiss nobleman turned developer named Jean-Pierre Pury brought 600 Protestant Swiss settlers here to populate a small planned town. The settlement proved unsuccessful, though some residents did remain. With the dawn of America's struggle for independence, tiny little Purysburg took on an outsized military importance as a strategic crossing between Georgia and South Carolina.
It was connected by road to Charleston. It was on the Savannah River, which was the major highway of the time, the waterway leading from the Atlantic to the interior, in an era where road transportation was often difficult.
Soon, Purysburg became the staging area for repeated American assaults on British-held Florida.
Purysburg figured into American military history beginning in right after the Declaration of Independence, where there were campaigns against East Florida. Troops from Georgia, North Carolina, Virginia, South Carolina, all went down toward the Florida line to attack the British-held East Florida.
So in 1776, 1777, and again in 1778, Purysburg was the assembly point for the South Carolina Continental troops and militia, where they would gather and assemble with their equipment and then cross at the ferry to Georgia to link up with the Georgians for these attempts to invade East Florida, all of which were unsuccessful.
By late 1778, the British military shifted its attention to the southern colonies. In late December, British forces under Lieutenant Colonel Archibald Campbell captured Patriot-held Savannah, returning Royal Governor James Wright to power and imprisoning rebel leaders. The remnants of the American Army retreated 12 miles upriver to Purysburg, where they linked up with Generals Benjamin Lincoln and William Moultrie. Over the next few weeks, both sides experienced major victories and defeats. Colonel Campbell took control of Augusta shortly after seizing Savannah, but Loyalist troops were hammered by Patriot commander Andrew Pickens at Kettle Creek on February 14th. On March 3rd, the British turned the tables and nearly decimated the Georgia Continental Army at Briar Creek. Now the stage was set for the next chapter of the conflict. The British marched to Charleston, South Carolina, and Purysburg was ground zero.
If Lincoln was going to keep the British in check, Purysburg was the place to do it.
Unfortunately for the Patriots, General Lincoln marched his army of more than 4,000 men out of Purysburg and toward the contested city of Augusta, leaving the door open for British forces to seize this pivotal point on the Savannah River. Lincoln left behind a token force of Patriot troops to keep an eye out for any British attacks. This tiny contingent, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Alexander McIntosh, consisted of the 2nd and 5th South Carolina Continental Infantry Detachments, members of the South Carolina Militia, and a Charlestown Militia Detachment, also possibly a detachment from the 4th South Carolina Regiment of Artillery, In all, probably less than 300 men. The American force occupied a massive series of earthen fortifications designed for many hundreds of troops. Their orders were not to defend this post, but rather to serve as lookouts. The Patriots didn't have to wait long for the British to make their move. On April 28, 1779, a 2,500-man strong British force under Major General Augustin Prevost set out from Ebenezer on the Georgia side of the river. There were veteran soldiers in this group, 2 battalions of the 71st Regiment of Foot, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel John Maitland. These much-feared Scottish soldiers were known as Fraser's Highlanders.
They're some of the most battle-hardened, experienced troops that the British had in North America. They were well-led, well-trained, well-equipped, and anyone would be scared to be in the path of the bayonet-yielding 71st Fraser's Highlanders.
There was also a mixed light infantry unit made up of the best men from many different regiments. Major Colin Graham commanded this group. Loyalist Creek Indians rounded out the British force. Prevost's army marched 11 miles to the town of Abercorn. From there, the Redcoats and their Loyalist American allies boarded boats and moved down Abercorn Creek to the Savannah River. The army continued upstream to a small island in the river where roughly 1,000 men camped, while 1,500 men walked through the swamp towards Purysburg. The cold swamp water was often so deep that the troops sank up to their chins. They traveled light, leaving behind their heavy equipment, and the weapons they carried were rendered useless by the water and mud.
All their ammunition got totally soaked. They were walking through the swamp all night long, up to their necks, and they didn't put them on top of their heads, so I guess their ammunition got wet and they were unable to shoot.
The miserable march finally brought the soggy men onto dry ground around 8 a.m. The stealth march continued for at least 4 more miles until they reached the southern edge of Purysburg 2 hours later. When the British Army arrived at the southern end of the town, it caught the American defenders completely off guard.
No one really expected the British to launch an offensive at this time, especially in such strength. What Prevost did was very surprising. Even Henry Clinton, who was Commander-in-Chief of the British Army in New York, had no idea Prevost was doing this. If the Americans were surprised by this, so was Prevost's own superior.
Not only was the British attack a surprise, it also came from an unexpected direction.
This is a bend in the river. They were expecting the British to come upriver, so they probably had cannons positioned up along the bluff here to catch them as they're turning the curve here. So had they attacked that way, the Americans would have been ready for them.
Though their muskets would not fire, the British troops still possessed a formidable weapon, the bayonet, a sharp metal blade more than a foot long. Affixed to the end of a musket barrel, this tearing and puncturing weapon often proved more deadly than a firearm when it was handled by an experienced soldier.
In the 18th century, the power of the British Army was not in its musketry, the power was in its concerted bayonet charge. And when 500 people come out a parapet with bayonets fixed, most folks know it's time to get out of there.
The Redcoats and their Indian allies swooped northward toward the settlement. The Patriots didn't stand a chance. They let loose with musket and rifle volleys and even a few cannon blasts, but quickly turned and fled.
There's some resistance, but for the most part, the Americans fire a few shots and run away.
You got to remember that when you have a number of trained British soldiers, more than likely making a bayonet charge, that gets the point across in a hurry. You maybe fire your musket once or twice, and then your idea is retreating by the most expeditious route, which is probably into some swamp somewhere.
This was a very brief battle. The soldiers on the American side, probably, some of them may have only got off one shot.
The fighting was over in less than 2 hours. The British had carried the day and taken the field without firing a single shot. The bulk of the Patriot force escaped, though some were captured or killed. The remainder of the American troops marched for more than 20 miles and eventually linked up with General Moultrie near Coosawhatchie Creek. If the British troops had pursued the fleeing Patriots, they might have dealt an even more crushing blow to the American cause. But instead, the exhausted victors halted on the field, drying off, warming up, and availing themselves of the abandoned Patriot food and supplies.
But these troops were probably exhausted. They had been exposed to the elements. Many of them were probably soaking wet up to the armpits. The temperatures at night in the springtime could easily be in the high 40s. Probably maximum adrenaline effort to storm a prepared earthwork against prepared soldiers. I suspect that they were fairly spent. The other thing is there were probably a good many goodies there at Purysburg, supplies and maybe horses, tack, munitions that the British if they didn't want to keep it, they certainly didn't want it in rebel hands.
The remainder of the British Army reached Purysburg by boat late in the day after the fighting was over. The British victory was a mixed blessing for the King's cause. British General Prevost had intended to bring his entire 2,500-man army across the Savannah River at once and push on into South Carolina. The delay at Purysburg caused the British to lose the initiative for a short time.
General Prevost afterwards said that he regretted the fact that he was not able to get all of his troops across as quickly as he had intended. So from the British perspective, they felt that they did not achieve as much as they could have. But to get a large force across a swollen river with the crossing points all guarded, at least to some extent, by American troops was still a significant achievement.
Because of the Americans being here and stalling them a little bit, kind of took the wind out of their the sails of their rapid fire victories and slowed them down for a year. They did eventually take Charleston, but they could have had it a year earlier had there not been this resistance here.
Still, the short battle at Purysburg paved the way for subsequent British victories.
Purysburg absolutely does matter, because once the light infantry storms over the parapets at Purysburg and the defenders take off, then the whole British Southern Army can leisurely come over and bring their supplies, bring their horses, bring their artillery, and come over in force unopposed.
It was a very wise operational decision because it totally disconcerted Lincoln's plans. It threatened Charleston for a time. It inflicted losses in terms of both troops and property destruction on the Americans. So in all ways, really, it was as successful as it could have been.
The general location of the Purysburg battlefield was an open secret for more than 200 years. So when a team of 6 archaeologists arrived on the scene in early 2015, their goal was to pinpoint the exact spots where specific things happened, where the British attacked, where the Patriot defenders made their stand, and maybe even where some of the structures in the colonial town once stood.
The work that we're doing is really the ground level, first glimpse at these areas to see what sort of archaeological footprint the American Revolution may have left.
Archaeologists Dan and Rita Elliott of the Georgia-based LAMAR Institute spearheaded the work, which was funded by a grant from the National Park Service's American Battlefield Protection Program. It's a familiar battlefield for Elliott, who first dug at the site as a young archaeologist just starting his career.
The Purysburg story for me is a personal one. I worked there in 1984, so it's been 30 years since I was there last. And this is a chance to get back and document a site that I worked on 30 years ago when I was a little youngster. And so it's personally an important battlefield.
The work began the previous month, far from the field of battle, in archives and libraries from Washington, D.C. to New York to Boston. There, the Elliots scoured collections for rare documents and maps that could shed light on the events of April 29, 1779.
We're going to be spending about 3 weeks on the road at historical archives, looking up more information, trying to get more maps of the town, more letters describing the battle, and tangible geographic information about the town that'll help develop the context for the field work.
The archaeologists also consulted with local history buffs and metal detecting enthusiasts who have been scouring the site for decades. Then the Elliots met with landowners to obtain permission to conduct surveys on their property. The first steps in the field involved a controlled metal detector survey over the entire area to which the team had access. The archaeologists moved their detectors back and forth carefully in straight lines roughly 6 feet apart. The searchers marked the GPS coordinates of each artifact they discovered. The items were photographed, and the researchers took detailed notes about each find. Each artifact's GPS coordinates were entered into a GIS computer map of the site.
Technology today is wonderful for archaeology. We still use the shovel, but we use all these other techniques that help us a lot, and GPS is one of them.
The next step involved a technology known as LIDAR, which uses reflected laser light to accurately map the surface of the ground. LIDAR enabled the archaeologists to see features such as fortifications, which had been obscured over the centuries. Much to the team's delight, they found evidence of more than one fortification that stood here during the battle.
When we started, we didn't know there were any forts there. We knew there was one ditch that was military, but it was thought to be Civil War period. We immediately determined that it was Revolutionary War period. We also found 2 of the shovels underneath it that were used to dig the ditch itself, and they were 18th century shovels. We found fragments of other earthworks that had been kind of mangled by logging equipment, but they were still there. We were able to see little traces, remnants of these forts. And then there were 2 forts that were completely gone. The only way we know they exist is from a 1938 aerial photograph of the area when you could still see the outline of the thing. It was later on, from logging and agriculture, it was flattened out.
At this stage, the archival research conducted before the dig came directly into play, as fieldwork revealed buried structures that lined up with features in documents from the period.
We also used historic maps that were drawn about 3 or 4 months earlier than the battle, showing the layout of the troops and the different positions of the artillery and that sort of thing. And our data from the archaeological survey pretty well substantiates that map. It makes it, they kind of help support each other. Okay, we're getting closer to the southwest corner of town, and this is where the earthworks are. I'm walking down the center of the earthworks. It's a low ditch with a mounded up earth on the west side. But this would have been a long rifle trench, about 250 yards long. Earlier, there would have been about 4,000 American troops here. So you would have had just lots and lots of artillery and many more men than were here on the day of the battle.
When the mapping was complete, team members turned to old-fashioned shovels to dig deeper and see what lay beneath the soil. They excavated multiple rectangular test pits in areas where the metal detector surveys had detected large concentrations of artifacts. Within the neat, sharply defined pits, the archaeologists found features of the battlefield and surrounding area, including trash pits and household items, as well as musket balls and artillery fragments. Tellingly, all of the musket balls were American, bolstering the Elliott's theory that all of the British ammunition was too wet to shoot.
The total number of British musket balls that we found was none, 0.
In all, 110 Patriot musket balls were unearthed, but many of the American projectiles the team found came not from large government-issued muskets, but rather from small caliber weapons that would have been carried by Patriot militia.
But a good number of the bullets that we found are rifle balls that would have been shot out of a rifled gun, more accurate than the other bullets. So these would have been kind of sharpshooters. These would have been men who, their weapons didn't have a bayonet on them, so they weren't very good in a situation where somebody's coming at you with a bayonet, but they were more accurate from a distance.
But other Patriot weapons packed a more powerful and effective punch.
But we found 2 hollow cannonballs on the battlefield, and we found about 3 iron, what we call case shot. We also found some lead ones, smaller lead ones. These would have been fired in a bag, and they're basically anti-personnel armament.
The final stage of fieldwork brought in another technology called ground-penetrating radar. Using a device that resembles a baby carriage, team members worked in a style they called mowing the lawn, pushing the wheeled device back and forth in straight lines, using energy beams to see structures and soil disturbances that lay underground.
We'll boost the signal down in this lower stuff and bring out any kind of subtle differences. You can see in the profile, we kind of need to know what's going on pretty shallow, so we're really kind of wanting to see something show up here. If you see metal, if we go over like a big metal object, it'll make like a repeating kind of staccato-y signal down the line, because this thing doesn't go through metal.
Okay.
Large metal objects, it'll map the top of them and then it'll just have an echo below that.
It was this phase of the work that revealed an unexpected, exciting discovery, though one not directly related to the battlefield. The team uncovered a colonial, pre-Revolutionary War period pottery manufacturing site, the only one ever pinpointed in the region.
Well, this is the first early pottery site found on the Savannah River Valley from the colonial period. It's one that archaeologists and ceramics experts have been sort of hoping would turn up. If there was one house lot on this town I would want to find, it would be this one. Out of 455, this is the kind of the holy grail of Purysburg archaeology. So we nailed it on the head pretty much by finding this, and pretty excited about it.
The cool thing about these are it's got all this yellow slip and glaze puddled up in the bottom of it. So we're getting hunks of this glaze and slip in the feature here, which is a lot of the glaze left over from what the potters were using. So it's kind of cool to have actual pockets of it in different places that they're throwing out and tossing out when they're done with it.
When fieldwork ended in February 2015, the thousands of artifacts unearthed at Purysburg were brought to the LAMAR Institute's laboratory in Effingham County, Georgia. Here, team members cleaned and preserved the artifacts and synthesized all of the information gleaned from the various methods of study into a complete picture of what the team discovered. Using the GPS and GIS maps of the site and the location of the artifacts found there, the archaeologists worked like crime scene detectives, interpreting position, depth, and context to tell the story of the battle.
So there's basically two types of bullets out there. There's the impacted fired bullets that are being shot at the British. So where we find these is about where the British were standing or running. And then we find the bullets that haven't been impacted. These are dropped balls. So these are in the locations where the American Patriots are standing. The ones that are impacted are being shot at the British. The ones that are not impacted are being dropped by fumbling men as they're in the heat of battle. So the bullets that hit things are deformed and smushed. This one looks like it slammed into sand. So it didn't hit anybody, but it landed in the dirt. And when it did that, it makes kind of an interesting pattern on the bottom.
Now a new high-tech tool came into play, portable X-ray fluorescence. It's a laser device that measures the metal element content of each projectile, possibly an indicator of where the ball was created and by whom. In addition to lead, which was expected, the musket balls found at Purysburg contained other additives, including tin and antimony.
It's basically a little ray gun that shoots X-rays into the musket ball, and it essentially gives these things a fingerprint. It enables us to identify the ball, what they're made out of, and hopefully in the future, after we have enough of these done, we'll be able to identify just from the lead alone, whose bullet it was and who was shooting at who.
Now that fieldwork and laboratory analysis is nearing completion and the artifacts are conserved, the team is turning its attention outward and focusing on sharing its finds with the community. Though the events at Purysburg on April 29, 1779 were brief and casualties were relatively light, this little battle had a big impact on the Revolution in the South, and the archaeological work at the site helps make the picture of this theater of the struggle more complete.
One of the interesting things about our survey is that we found the entire battlefield. We pretty well have all surrounded this battlefield and know that we found every piece of the story that was there.
The archaeological record at Purysburg is stunning, considering that there is a modern community built on top of the colonial community and that the whole area was plowed and planted. To be able to go there, to identify it, to find the backstory in writing, and then be able to put it on the ground is amazing.
Revolutionary War activity was big in Jasper County in the 79, 80, 1778, that period, and most people don't know about it, but it's a key component of American history right there underneath their feet. So how rich to share that with people and let that just color their perspective, because it is part of their history.
This is a It's a study in the sociology of warfare. It's a study in American history. It's proven we can kind of set a goal, go out and find these battlefields, and then document them through archaeology. It's a battle that was almost totally unknown. So now we're going to put it on the map, and it'll be in the history books. So that gives me a little bit of satisfaction.
For more information on the Battle of Purysburg, go to www.thelamarinstitute.org.
Is that high up enough?
We'll see. That screen's a honking big screen, but
Yeah.
let's try it and see.
Okay, sure.
Swing that leg around that way. Maybe. Okay, let's move the whole thing back close behind me. All right.
What's this, Rita?
Ooh, nice. Nice. Wow.
And again, here's our flag there, there's our flag there, and this thing is right on the wall. If this is a fort, it's on the wall of the fort. The town, maybe it's on the edge of town.
Well, you know, one of the sources say the fort's on the north side of town, and this
Well-
is not the north side of town. So
Well, if that was,
exactly. So if the north side of town back then was here, that would be, it would make sense.